Stanford University.
This is Steve Player. I'm with the Stanford Historical Society's Oral History Program. Today is August 19th, 2016, and I'm here with Stanford University's Jerry Porras, who is a Lane Professor in the Graduate School of Business, emeritus. And we are conducting this interview as part of the Stanford Athletics Oral History Project, and we're doing so at the Knight Management Center on the Stanford campus. And Jerry, I'd like to begin by asking you to tell us about what brought you to Stanford, and ultimately we'll go to what got you interested in athletics and what have you. But let's start with, what was it that motivated you to come to Stanford University?
Well, I was a PhD student at UCLA, completing my doctoral work and looking for positions in various places. And in fact, my coming to Stanford was almost an afterthought in the process. It really wasn't in the front end of it, because what I was doing was I was going out and interviewing a variety of schools, and had actually settled on staying in Los Angeles in a brand new school. It was a state university school that was just being opened up at the time. This was in 1972. And I was essentially going to be building their organizational behavior group, which sounded like an interesting thing because it was a brand new business school that they had as part of the overall university there. And kind of late in the game, I was contacted by Stanford saying, "Are you interested in coming up and talking to us about a position here?" And so I came up, and things seemed to click, and I was given an offer. And so then I had to sort of tell these people down in LA that we were going to not be there. My wife and I really liked LA. We'd been there for 4 years at UCLA, and we'd had other connections with it. So it was kind of sad leaving it, but we'd also lived up here. I was stationed in San Francisco when I was in the Army, and then worked down here for Lockheed for a year. And my wife had been, although she's from Arizona, she moved here when she graduated and was a elementary school teacher in San Carlos. So we had ties to the area and friends that we had from a really long time back. I had some boyhood friends that were living here fortuitously. So it was a big draw in that way. And then of course Stanford was an incredible draw. The business school was much smaller than it is today, and the organizational behavior group was only 3 people that were in it, and they were hiring 3 more. So we were doubling the size of the group. So it was an exciting opportunity, and that's why I decided to come.
Great. Well, while you were here at Stanford, what were you were a professor in the business school, and then what were you mentioned your organizational behavior was your focus, and then what kind of let's kind of lead up to going into being a faculty's athletic representative.
Okay. My area especially was organizational change, organizational development. And so I taught courses in that area, and also taught courses in interpersonal dynamics, which is using groups to help people improve their interpersonal capabilities, because we believe that that's one of the most important tools of management. And it's an important tool for organizational change. For if managers start changing their behavior, then you begin to get different behaviors in the company. So that was my focus. I taught courses in that area, and I arrived as assistant professor, and over time got tenure, and then was promoted to full professor. I had been interested in athletics only through really kind of a circuitous route, in that back in I think it might have been in the early 80s, some of the football coaches had decided that what they would like to do is have students speak to faculty members as they were thinking about coming here. So in the recruitment process, the notion, which I really strongly supported then and do to this day, is that, look, you're coming to Stanford, and Stanford is an academic institution. And clearly you're coming to play football in part, but you're also coming to be a student. And an important part of being a student is that you interact with faculty, you take classes. And as a result of that idea, that it made a lot of sense for you to talk to faculty and you to get to know some faculty and see what things are like and have faculty get to know you. And that was an important part of attracting young men to come to the football program. So some of us were asked to talk to these students. And since we don't have an undergraduate business school, which is a real challenge, and by the way, we were recruiting up against schools that did have undergraduate programs. Notre Dame was one of them. Cal had an undergraduate program. And at that time, even UCLA, no, I think they had abandoned their undergraduate program, but the competing schools had undergraduate programs in business, and so how could we attract someone here when we didn't have a formal undergraduate business program? And so that's why I think the coaches wanted to talk to some faculty in the business school and have us talk to the students and explain to them what alternatives existed for them. Yeah. So I got involved in that recruiting process, and it was just periodically we'd talk to 2 or 3 each year and attend a breakfast luncheon with them and did that over the course of several years, and that's how I got to know the people in athletics.
And who do you recall who the coach was? The head coach was during those days?
I do not. I do not recall it. It would have been probably in the early to mid '80s. So
Elway or Wigan was there then.
Wigan was for sure. I think was a coach while we were doing that. But Elway was after Wigan, wasn't he?
Right. Yeah. It was after.
So it just continued after that. But it could have been Wigan that started it. Before Wigan was, coach had been here a long time. I can't remember who that was. But in any case, it was, and I think the idea, I don't know if the idea came from the head coach or if the assistant coaches who were the ones out recruiting, always looking for different ways to connect with the students. But it was a good idea, and several faculty were contacted. It wasn't just me. And faculty outside of the business school too, because certainly some students were interested in other things. But a small number started getting put together, and we started talking to the students.
And Jerry, how did you hear about or develop an interest in being the faculty representative? Did the department talk with you, or did you talk with them, or?
No, that's an interesting, very interesting way that occurred. Jack Friedenthal was the faculty athletics representative at the time. He was in the law school, and he had been the rep for quite a few years. I think it was at least 10, maybe longer. And so as I got more involved with the recruiting and had more contact with the athletic department, I met Jack and got to know him and got to know what he was doing. And I recall one day saying to him, Jack, the only position in the university that I crave is yours, the faculty athletics representative. I said, I wouldn't want to be anything else. And he said, well, I'm not ready to leave. So I said, okay. And he was a relatively young man. So I thought, well, that'll never happen then. But about 2 to 3 years later, he gets offered this deanship at, I think it's George Washington. And so he leaves. And so then the search is on, and Don Kennedy was the president at the time. And so then a search started up for a faculty rep. So there were not any sort of self-nominations, but nominations were asked, from the community at large. And so I had a very good friend here, Gene Webb, who was also involved in the faculty recruiting stuff. He was a real avid fan. And I said, I really would like to be considered for that. He said, I'll write a letter for you. So he wrote a letter to to Kennedy suggesting me, and I'm sure a lot of others were suggested. But then Don contacted me and asked me if I wanted to do it, and I said absolutely. So I really have enjoyed it. I enjoyed it from the very beginning.
And when was that? What year? Do you remember?
I think it was 88.
88. And why did you crave that position?
Well, it was fun for a wide variety of reasons. One, it had connections with the athletic program, and I'm a sports fan, so it had connections with all the sports, not just football. And that was one thing. Second thing, it had connection with the students, the student athletes, who are a real special breed of person, and I thought that would be fun to do. And then thirdly, I really liked the way the athletic department operated. It sort of was a participative way. People made their inputs into what was going on, what they wanted to do, and then they made decisions quickly, and then they implemented the decisions. And this is in sharp contrast to faculty who talk and talk and talk about decisions. They finally think they make a decision, and then when they start to implement them, they find some things that aren't going right. They go back and revisit the decision, come up with a new decision. So it just drags on and on and on, and it just doesn't move very quickly. Whereas athletics moves quickly. When they decide to do something, they get it done. And I really liked that. And I thought it was a nice balance to my experiences as a faculty member to be around an organization that moved and did things rapidly. So I liked that. And then finally, I really liked the idea of, and probably this was the sort of the most positive driving force of all, so I shouldn't say finally, I liked the idea of the student and the athlete, that we were trying to do both, that we were trying to have students be great athletes and great athletes be great students, and that we weren't wanting to compromise one for the other. That contrary to everybody else in the country, I think, we thought we could do both, and that was what we were going to try to do. And that was a very appealing idea to me. I didn't like the idea of having the students come in and just be athletes and be in a sort of semi-professional state and have special things done that catered to them and that made it easy for them to get through school, and they wouldn't get an education, and all the bad things that we can attribute to a lot of programs. I didn't like that as a way of operating, and Stanford didn't seem to be operating in that way and didn't want to operate in that
Right.
way. Now, clearly it wasn't perfect, and to this day it isn't perfect, but it certainly has, I think, near perfect aspirations about what it wants to be.
Well, Jerry, as a faculty representative, what was the nature of your duties? Do you recall what
Well,
responsibilities were?
most of the duties are fairly undefined, and it's kind of like you make it what you want it to be as much as anything. There are some things that are prescribed. One is that I would represent Stanford to the NCAA. So in the NCAA convention, I was Stanford's representative, unless the president was there at the conventions. And in all other cases, I would represent Stanford. So that was one. And the same would be true for the Pac-10 at the time, that I would represent Stanford at the Pac-10 meetings and in the various gatherings of the conference, that I would be representing the university unless the president was there again. So those were fairly clearly defined. A third one that was fairly clearly defined is that I had kind of general responsibility for compliance, that I was responsible for making sure Stanford followed the rules, and if the rules were broken in some way, I had the responsibility for understanding, investigating that, and helping to prescribe what actions we might take in response to those violations. So now the compliance part has a lot of components to it, and you really start thinking about it more deeply. I mean, there's the whole mechanical part of filling out forms and making sure that we're doing the right things in that. That's kind of the bureaucratic side of it. But I think more importantly, and what I focused on as much as anything, was creating a culture of compliance, in which the whole athletic department, from the student athletes to the coaches to the staff, all felt that that operating according to the rules was the way we wanted to operate, that this was important to us. It was part of our basic value system. And so a lot of what I found myself doing was really promoting that value system and trying to encourage it as much as I could, and working with the senior administrators, athletic director, as a start, and the associate athletic directors, and just continuing to discuss components of these ideas about the values guiding what we did, and especially the value of compliance, and making sure that they really believed them and supported them and followed them. And if I saw where there were things that were happening that I thought were inconsistent with those values, I try to surface them and help them deal with them, so that we could be as consistent as we could possibly humanly be in pursuing the value of complying with the rules.
And who was the athletic director?
Andy Geiger was the athletic director initially, but only for like a couple of years. I think it was. I think he fired Wiggins and hired Elway, and then he left a year after Elway. And firing Wiggins was such a hard thing for him to do. He said to me, "This is the last coach I'll ever fire," because it was so difficult. And then hiring Elway just seemed like a really bright spot because of his son and all that. But then he decided to leave, and I think he went to Maryland.
Went to Maryland, you're right.
And that was very sudden. I had no signal that was happening, and then we hired Ted Leland.
Ted.
Yes.
Did you, when you worked on compliance, was it compliance with kind of each sport, and are mostly working with coaches, or did you work with the student athletes themselves and let them know what they had to take, at least what they should be doing in the classroom, or where was your main thrust with the administration?
My main thrust was really working with the staff, the administration, and the coaches, and very little kind of doing no preaching to the students about it, because I think that really the people that have the biggest impact on the students in that setting are really the coaches, and the coaches have to believe that what we're trying to do is what they should be trying to do. They have to believe that the students are students as well as athletes, and they have to believe that at Stanford we're going to follow the rules, and not only going to follow the rules, we're going to follow not only the letter but also the spirit, because it's too easy, and so many coaches in their experiences before they come to Stanford know that you can do a lot of following the rule but not the spirit, and they're very, very clever at finding ways to get around the rules as they might exist, but they're violating the spirit. So what we try to promote was following not only the rules, the letter of the rules, but also the spirit of the rules, and that was a real challenge when coaches come in from the outside, because coaches all feel that Stanford is not really different from any other job they've ever had. And I recall numerous conversations with coaches saying, well, we think Stanford's a little bit different. Oh no, I've worked at private schools. I worked at Notre Dame, or I worked at Northwestern or some other private university, and I know what they're like. And then a year later I talk to them and say, well, how's the year been? And they say, I never would have thought that Stanford was the way it was. So it wasn't like every place else.
I read an article about you and had one or two little incidents of say, well, we did it this other way somewhere else, but you had to tell them we do it a certain way here.
Yeah. There's also the attitude about the student athlete being a student, and I recall a conversation I had with a football coach, and he said to me, my job is on the football field, and what happens on the football field is all I'm responsible for. in terms of the student athlete. And I said, no. I said, you also have a responsibility around what the student does academically and their whole academic side. And he just totally disagreed with me. And I was unable to change his mind. Interestingly enough, a few years later, the head football coach resigned, and this guy was a candidate for that position, but he didn't get it. And he was never going to get it because that attitude isn't what we really want at Stanford. We want people who feel that they're responsible for the whole student, and being a student is an important part of what they're doing here.
And do you feel that Stanford still is acting that way and feeling that way in how they deal with students and how they deal with the approach to being an athlete and also being a student? Is that changing, or is that the same?
Yeah, well, clearly I'm not as intimately involved as I was when I was the faculty rep, but my view is that yes, it's still the same. It hasn't changed, and I think David Shaw as the coach, who was a student here, and who really understood and understands the relationship between athletics and academics and how both are equally important. It seems to me that he is emphasizing that and delivers that message to his assistant coaches. And as far as I can tell, I mean, people don't show up for practice because they have to take a final exam, which just happened this past few days,
right,
with McCaffrey, right? So, I mean, it's not like football dominates and says, you can't take a course, you can't do a lab because you got to come to practice. That there are adaptations and adjustments that get made. Now, it's not totally open, do whatever you want, and so balances are struck. But it seems to me that there still is that emphasis, but you can't ever stop emphasizing it.
Jerry, that emphasis that Stanford has, which I personally agree with, in your experience as a rep with and interacting with other schools in the Pac-10 and now the Pac-12, were they similar? Are we different? Is Stanford set apart in some way as being a different experience for the athlete than, say, some other school in the conference?
Oh, it was really different.
And how was it different?
Well, it was different in that by and large, the student athletes at other schools see themselves as athletes, and maybe students, and it varies dramatically across the individuals. But the message seems to be that that the reason you're here is for athletics, and you've got to go to class because you have to complete a certain number of units each quarter and so on, and just to comply with the rules. But in terms of being willing to sacrifice anything on the athletic side for the academic side, that mentality just didn't seem to exist. And people like to pretend that it does, but when you really get down to the nitty-gritty, the emphasis just isn't there as strongly as it is here. Now, I don't want to say there's zero emphasis, because that would be wrong. There is an emphasis on the academic side, but it's not anywhere near what I think we emphasize. And it was there, and the faculty reps from the other places would tell me that, but they had to operate in the context of their own systems and their own athletic departments, and the emphasis that was placed on athletics by the administration of the universities as well as the administration inside the athletic departments.
Now, was there a time when all the faculty representatives met? Was there a kind of
yes,
conference or
we'd have
regular meetings?
We would have conference meetings twice a year,
mm-hmm.
and the conference council at that time was composed of the president of each university, the athletic director, and the faculty athletics representative, and the senior women's administrator. So those four individuals from each school would show up at these meetings twice a year, and conference issues would be discussed and various votes would be taken. And so in the context of those meetings, the faculty representatives would meet alone for a period of time, and the presidents would, and so each of the groups would meet alone, and then we'd meet all together. So yes, we would meet on a regular basis, and we knew each other pretty well, and we would discuss various issues. So I'd kind of hear what was going on.
What kind of issues were you discussing at those meetings?
Well, a lot of it were rules-related issues, because there was constantly a set of rules. The most difficult ones to deal with around recruiting. Seems like every time a rule comes up to try to restrict an excess, someone figures out ways around it and comes up with something else that's excessive. So for example, earlier on during the recruiting process, it was okay because it wasn't said that it wasn't legal. It was okay for a school to get a private corporate jet to go pick up the recruit at their house, wherever they were, and fly them to the school. This was in football mainly, in basketball. And most of the excesses are in those two sports. And so then a rule had to be passed that no, it had to be a commercial airline flight. So then what started happening was that the commercial airline flight would arrive, and outside of the airport would be a limousine with several of the song girls in the back seat of the limousine welcoming the recruit.
Hear this.
Okay. And so a rule had to be passed about that, and it's a constant challenge around recruiting and what you can do to recruit and what's legal and what's not legal. So we would discuss primarily the rules that were going on because that was an important part of what the meetings were about, because they often would be in preparation for the NCAA meetings, in which the conference would take a position, but each individual school would vote in those NCAA meetings. At that time, we had meetings of everybody coming together.
Now, did you play a role in the NCAA? Were you involved as an officer or a leader in the NCAA at any time?
Yeah, I was not. I chose not to spend a lot of time at the NCAA level. I spent my time at the conference level.
Did you, speaking about discussing rules and regulations, around that time there was an issue about Prop 42, which had to do with academic eligibility and what kids could play and what they had to do. And there was some discussion about that, and Stanford actually voted to support it, as I recall.
Right.
And some of the other schools did not.
Right.
Was that? Talk a little bit about that.
Certainly that was an era in which it was pretty clear that students were just barely skimping by. The academic side was just not very important. It's kind of a part of a bigger picture, and the admissions process, and who could be admitted, and what kind of test scores would you have to have, or what kind of GPA would you have to have, and if you didn't comply with that, then could you be admitted to the university as part of the athletic program or not, and could you play or not, and then once you got in, could you make progress? Would you have to make progress through the program, and at the end of 2 years be at a certain level, and so on. So definitely Stanford and I were in strong support of creating rules that really lifted up the academic performance of the students, put more emphasis on the academic side, and give them a chance to really get an education. So if the rules were kind of forcing the coaching staff and the athletic departments to support more of the academic development of the student, then that was a good thing. And so we were definitely supporting those, and very often they just weren't strong enough in our opinion. But we're in the minority on those positions, and very often the votes would be 9-1 on some more stringent level of that the test score ought to be this, or the GPA ought to be that, or the progress ought to be this, and I'd vote yes, and everyone would vote no. So we kind of had to compromise it a little bit.
And so just so I'm clear on the governance, so that if we voted no and they voted yes, or vice versa on issues, the majority would be the position of the league that would then go to the NCAA. I mean,
right. From the point of view of the conference vote, the conference had one vote, and each school has one vote.
Mm-hmm.
So there basically would be 11 votes coming out of the Pac-10 at that time. And so in the voting process, I'd be sitting there, and we all had paddles, and we'd hold the paddle up if we voted for something or against it, and the conference would do the same. The conference commissioner would do the same. So the majority position was what the conference would vote, but then each university would vote its own position.
What, Jerry, just kind of moving a little bit along also on this thing, you served under what athletic directors?
Geiger, Leland, and then Bowlesby.
So were you involved in the choice of Leland?
Yes.
After?
Yes.
And what was it about Ted that, to the extent you can comment on it, that made the recommendation for him to be the new athletic director?
Well, I think the thing that for me really swayed it, there were two things. One is who he was as a person. I felt that he was a honorable guy. I think I believe that his values were very consistent with the values that we had here at Stanford. He had experience being here at Stanford. He was a PhD student here, and so he understood what it was all about. He understood the student athletes well. He had a value that I really liked, that he would state in this way, as I recall. When I have a big decision to make, I always ask myself, what's best for the students? And that's the primary driver of my decision making. I liked that. I thought that was a very good position to take and a good screen to use, instead of thinking, well, what do the coaches want, or how can I make more money out of this, or what are the boosters going to want? What's best for the student? And I think that was definitely a key in what I found in him to be very attractive. And then connected with that was his position and emphasis on the academic side of being here. He had a PhD. He knew the value of academics. It wasn't just something that he spouted out. I think he really believed it, and he behaved consistently with that. And I liked those things.
When I think of Stanford athletics, I think of Stanford academics. They're all on the very highest plane. And people looking at Stanford saying, how do they do it? How do they maintain both? What do you think allows Stanford to continue to compete? You really have seen it grow. You've seen the athletic department grow. You've seen 3 different directors. Is there any formula or any, I don't know, secret, we'll call it, that you think resulted in Stanford being able to do what they're doing today? 22 directors' cups and 40 years of at least one NCAA championship. I mean, these are phenomenal things.
Yeah. I think that the really the powerful theme that's gone throughout all the years is a consistent commitment to our values. We value excellence, and across the board in everything we do, and that's academically as well as in the athletic arena. So, and it's just not excellence in football; it's excellence in everything. And so that spreads across the entire program, and it's just something that we've held a firm belief in. We value the student as a student as well as an athlete, and that permeates the way we do things, the way we think about things. I think an important ingredient in how that gets spelled out is that our students are admitted through the admissions department. They're not admitted by the coaches.
Right.
And that's rare in the highly successful programs in the country, where the coaching staff has an incredibly strong, if not sole, authority over the admissions of student athletes. Now they claim that they're not doing it. There's an admissions group that does it, but in actual fact, it's the coaches that are doing the admissions, and we don't do that. I think our admissions department is one of the greatest protectors of our value system in terms of us maintaining this perspective, because they're the ones that admit. Clearly they get input from the athletic department, but they're the ones that make the decision.
Did you have any interaction with the admissions office as part of your job as faculty representative?
I did, and usually my interaction with them was around, if you get any pressure from a coach to admit a student because this person's a great athlete and they're just hounding you about it, I want to know about it, because I don't want them to do that. They can present their case, and then after that, boom, it's your decision. I don't ever want you to feel, if I can do anything about it, I don't ever want you to feel that you've been pressured to make a decision by the athletic department, because that is not what the athletic department here has the right to do. The decision is yours, not ours, not the athletic department. And so usually my conversations were around that, and I was often assured, no, I'm not getting, I never received a call from them saying, look, this coach has really stepped over the line, he's just gone too far. Never received a call about that.
Interesting. Jerry, I'd like to talk a little bit about Title IX and the impact you've seen on Stanford Athletics, and as you, as a faculty representative, really on the firing line with making sure that Stanford was complying with Title IX. I know it came in with Andy and was continued very forthrightly by Ted Leland and by Bob Bowlesby.
Right.
So talk a little bit about Title IX and your feelings on the impact of it on Stanford Athletics.
Well, I think the biggest bump in Title IX activities that happened during my time with the athletic department was really with Ted and Cheryl, and I think Cheryl played just a really key role in this.
Cheryl Levick,
excuse me. Yes, she was a senior women's administrator at the time, and she organized a small committee, put together a small committee that included one of our attorneys and myself and her. It was that small. I think there were only three of us. And what we did is we did a review of Stanford's Title IX position. I mean, where were we really? Were we complying with Title IX? And the answer was we weren't. Now, we were probably more in compliance with it than almost anybody else, but we weren't in full compliance with it. So the courageous thing that happened after that, which really I think speaks to the commitment that existed in both Ted and Cheryl, was, well, what do we do about it? Now, most other schools at the time, and I remember UCLA as an example, started cutting men's programs.
Right.
So I think they cut men's swimming and some other sports. But what Ted and Cheryl decided was that they were going to go in the opposite direction, that they were going to increase the number of women's programs. So I think we wound up adding 5 new women's programs over the course of 2 to 3 years. And the challenge was, well, how are they going to get funded? Because we certainly didn't have a lot of money, extra money, and the commitment there, I think, really reflects not only the athletic department but the whole Stanford community in terms of its views toward doing what is really the right thing to do. And Ted and Cheryl both believed that this was the right thing to do, to increase the number of women's sports. And so as they announced, they had a an event in which they announced the increase in the number of women's programs. Their view was that people who support Stanford Athletics would see that as the right thing to do, and as a result would wind up providing the support needed to add those women's programs. And that's exactly what happened. I know in conversations I had with various alumni who are strong supporters of the program, they said, we're giving more money to support this because it's the right thing to do. And that notion of it's the right thing to do, I think, was really an important perspective that underpins a lot of the community, is that it's the right thing to do, and so we're going to do it. And so then that was a huge bump. And the consequence of that, if you look at the Directors' Cups and look to see who's winning the Directors' Cups, it's women's athletics that are winning them.
Right.
They dominate the country. And the men's sports do pretty well, but without the women's sports operating at that level, we would not have won 21 or it's only 22. 22 straight.
Right.
We wouldn't have.
Right.
And they've been the pride and joy of this university.
Well, talk a little bit now about the financing of the athletic department. It's kind of a unique situation, and money that's raised, like the money they had to increase to raise to support Title IX. Where does that come from? It doesn't come from the university's operating budget, right? It's my understanding that the athletic department stands on its own 2 feet and doesn't get program support from the university. How is it financed? What are some of the things that they use?
Well, it's sort of like the tub on its own bottom, I think is a term that gets used. Right. That it's an independent operation and it's supposed to operate based on its own funds and not using university funds. There is a reality that happened in the late 80s into the 90s that it wasn't operating on its own bottom, and so it was securing loans from the university. And so it secured a loan. It had a loan balance. I don't know exactly how big it was. I wasn't involved in the financing decisions, but these are the sort of the information that I received. Is that there was a debt owed to the university for a period of time, because the athletic department was running in the red. I think that debt is no longer existing, but I'm not sure about that because I haven't been in contact. Now, so the money then mainly comes from the revenues that get generated through attendance at football, et cetera. And football's a big deal, and so when your football program isn't winning a lot of games and drawing capacity crowds, the revenues go down. And we went through a long era in which that was the case, and I think that was an important contributor. The alumni have been extremely generous and continue to boost the amount of money that they're giving to the university. And then early on, I think it was in the early 90s, a small group of alumni got together and created a fund. And many of them were investors, venture capitalists, et cetera, in the area, and so part of that fund was used to invest in various startups, et cetera, in the Silicon Valley, and some of them did very well. And so that fund grew from a very small amount to, I thought I may be wrong in this, but I think it reached 100 million.
It was called the Draper Fund.
The Draper Investment Fund.
And Frank Lodato, Jim Shepard, Bill Draper, I think, was part of that.
They were there, and Frank was really the kind.
Yeah, Frank was the key.
He was the spearhead of it. I think he came up with the idea.
And it's still operating.
It's still in operation.
Right.
Now, its goal, as I understood it, is mainly for substantial projects, like we're going to build a stadium. I think they use some of the fund for building the stadium. But it's so it's not used for kind of normal day-to-day operations. But it's been an important ingredient in continuing to support the growth of the athletic department. The alumni contributions, to a large degree, go to support scholarships. So the number of endowed scholarships has grown dramatically, and that's a huge, that's a huge contribution because our scholarship bill is pretty big.
Do you know offhand what a fully endowed scholarship costs today, roughly?
I do not.
Okay.
I do not. But if it's something like $60,000 a year,
It's going to be
or $70,000. Let's say it's $70,000 a year. At 5%, we could figure that out. So it's what? It's 1.4
about 1.4
million.
Yeah.
So I'd say it's probably in the 2 million range to endow a scholarship.
Okay.
Another area of endowment has been endowing the coaches' positions, and that's been substantial. So when money is put into an endowment, that really creates a long-term perspective and longevity in the activities. When it's just put into daily operations, that gets eaten up and it doesn't have the long-term effect. It can have maybe a short-term effect. So you have a combination of both, but many places ignore the longevity part and they don't endow.
They want it today.
Yeah, they want today. They want to build another facility today. They want to be bigger today.
Let me ask you a question about that. When you talk about financing, you talk about coaches' salaries, you talk about the cost of running, a program like Stanford's. How does the faculty in general feel about it? It's probably a too broad a question, but is part of your job working as a faculty representative, kind of taking the message to the rest of the faculty and representing the athletic department and say the faculty senate or somewhere where you can, let people know what's going on this side of the campus?
Yeah, I think an important part of the role is communicating with faculty. I think by and large, there's strong faculty support for the athletic department because it's doing things kind of like what we described in the right way. And I think a lot of professors have student athletes in their courses, and they get a chance to see the quality in them. Now, not all the student athletes are fantastic students, but enough of them are that there's a big positive impression in those students, and really in all the student athletes. And that's, I think, the bulk of the faculty. There are some faculty who don't believe that big time athletics has any place or any role in a high academic institution like Stanford, like the Ivy Leagues. They don't have big time athletics, and they want us to be like the Ivy Leagues. But that's a relatively small number. I think to a large degree, the support of the faculty can be evidenced by the number of faculty who are involved in recruiting student athletes. At one point in time, when I was more actively involved in that process, there was well over 100 people on the list that the coaches could call up and say, look, we've got a student athlete here who's interested in your subject, interested in history or interested in classics or languages or whatever. Would you talk to them? And they'd say, absolutely. Would you show up to a breakfast in which the student's going to be there with their parents? And they'd say yes. So we could have 20 to 30 people easily at one of these luncheons, and they would talk about their research to the whole group so that the parents and the students could hear that, but they'd interact with the students. So faculty being willing to come on a Saturday or a Sunday to attend a luncheon is, they're voting with their feet. They're not just saying, I support the department. They're actually doing something. And that number was pretty large. And so to the degree that reflects kind of a general tone, there are a reasonable number of faculty who aren't interested in athletics, and as long as it doesn't blemish the reputation of the university, they're willing to have it here. But I think the bulk of the faculty are supportive.
Thinking about that, looking at different styles of management and how you approach the issue and stuff. You worked with three different directors. In fact, you were responsible for hiring and recommending Bob Bowlesby, I understand.
Right.
How were they different and how were they similar in terms of, because I look at those three as really representing the start, Andy starting it and Ted continuing it and Bob really, especially in the football area, making a significant difference in the growth of the Stanford program. Were they similar, different? How did you find these guys?
They were very different. Andy liked to build.
Yes.
He liked to build. He liked to build facilities. He liked to add teams. He just kind of like had this growth mentality, and that was kind of his big driver. And I only worked with Andy for like a couple of years, so I can't say that I really knew him intimately in terms of all the components of him, because you need to work with someone for a long time and see them in a lot of different circumstances to get a real feel for what they're like. But he was a builder, and that was his main focus. And managing things, he kind of wasn't too interested in that. And so his budgets were not very well adhered to, and he was kind of always over budget in whatever he was doing because he was interested in building. Ted comes in, and Ted was, I think, also interested in building, but not so much building facilities, although a lot of facilities were built when he was here. But he was interested in building relationships, and he built very strong relationships with alumni, and he built strong relationships with his coaches and with the students, and with the staff. I mean, he really focused on that, and he focused on creating a culture that really was like a big family, and in doing that, really built, I think, excellence across a lot of dimensions, and it was reflected in the types of teams we had. And although we didn't have success in football, and people like to kind of point to football as the marker of whether you have a successful program or not, we had a very successful program, even though football wasn't operating at the level that it should have. The selection of the coaches just weren't good selections. I mean,
Yeah.
I think Ted today would admit that they were not good choices, and they were selected, for who knows exactly the reason. I don't know exactly the rationale, but they just didn't work out. But by and large, the quality of the coaching staff went way up during Ted's era across the board. I mean, in sports that no one focuses on very much, except the people who are doing them. I mean, the quality of coaches was really high. So I think he built a human system, and that was his emphasis. And he built relationships with the alumni, to the degree that the alumni just wanted to give more and more to us. And I think he built strong relationships with John Arriaga, who has been a very, very significant contributor to the athletic program from the point of view of the facilities. I mean, so much of the quality of the facilities is really related to John, and that's to a large degree based on the relationship that Ted built with him, and the relationship that Ray Perper, who was in charge of facilities, built with him. But Ted made Ray possible. I mean,
Right.
So it was kind of all linked together, and he had a good relationship with John, and which was, I think, an important part of being a really successful athletic director. So I think Ted's style was different than Andy's. Ted was, I think, more participative with his staff. I think Ted's appointment or support of Cheryl Levick as a senior women's administrator was really significant, and Cheryl played a very significant role in the development of the athletic department in general, but certainly women's sports in particular. And that wouldn't have been possible if Ted had not been very supportive of her, because I saw how other athletic directors throughout the Pac-10 dealt with their senior women's administrators, and no one dealt with them the way Ted dealt with Cheryl in supporting her and in providing the resources and the backing needed for her to really play a prominent role. Most of these places, they sort of shuffled the senior women's administrators in the background as much as possible, kept them as minimally effective as possible, and didn't really treat them as strong colleagues. But Ted treated Cheryl that way, and she was involved in all the key decisions that were made. Anytime I was ever there and asked to participate in a key decision, Cheryl was there. And that I think was a really significant contribution that Ted was making to the building of that department. Bob comes in, and Bob has more management skills, kind of classical business management skills. And so he built a lot of systems and did an effective job in building good systems inside of the athletic department. And certainly his hiring of Harbaugh changed the whole football program, and he had good instinct about who to hire in terms of the football program. He hired Johnny Dawkins, who I thought was an excellent hire, and for me was an ideal Stanford coach. Right. The one deficiency is that his program was not successful on the court. It was successful in every other way, but in terms of wins and losses, it wasn't sufficiently successful. But I think he had a long period to really try to be successful. Other places would have booted him out much sooner, in my opinion. But I think Stanford really kind of hung in with him, really wanting to make him successful, because he represented everything else that we want in a coach. And Bob, did that. He played a significant role in that. So I think he strengthened the department in a systematic, structural systems, procedures sort of way, which was very, very important. So each kind of brought in different skills and different capabilities into the department.
That's a great answer, and very good to see the difference between those guys, but keeping Stanford on the same trajectory toward excellence.
Just keeps getting better and better.
What about, and it might be too early to ask a question, but what about Bernard Muir? What sense do you have of what will be his legacy? It's probably too early to tell at this point.
I think it is. You really have to go through a lot of ups and downs to kind of be able to figure out what someone's legacy is. But he certainly brings in a strong image of a leader who's kind of centered. At least this is how I perceive him. He's centered and he's really solid, and he kind of knows where he's headed, and he's not going to be volatile and unpredictable. Can make tough decisions. I think it was a tough decision to fire Johnny, and I know that he didn't make that lightly, but a decision that needed to be made, and so I think he's going to continue to carry that trajectory up and up, because he seems to be doing the right things, doing difficult things, doing things that are easy but need to get done. But only time will tell.
Again, I don't want to take too much more of your time, but I'd like to ask you just a couple more quick questions. One, jumping back a little bit, between Andy's leaving and the hiring of Ted, there was a committee set up to look at athletics in general, to look at where we were with the deficits financially and where the program stood. Alan Cummings was the temporary AD at the time, and you were on the committee, and God, there's other Cory Booker was on the committee, and Jack Shepard, and frankly, all the names were on it. What was the purpose of that committee, and do you feel it came up with some recommendations that helped going forward when Ted took over? Or do you remember?
To be perfectly honest, I don't remember the full details of that committee. So anything that I would say would be really speculative about it. But I'd have to really go back and try to recapture those memories.
Understood. That was a long time ago.
Yes, yeah, it was because it was like 1991, I think.
Yeah, 1991. Let me see. I think, let me just ask you a couple more questions. One is, looking back at your career as a faculty rep, what was there anything that really stood out as an event that was either good or bad for you as you did your job and did this and had that experience? Is there anything that really stands out in your mind?
So like one signature event.
Yeah, right.
I can't say that any. I mean, there were. I can't say that any one thing sort of really is dominant in my mind. There are a series of things. My view of the decision to increase the number of women's sports was really a big event. I think, both then and today, the impact that's had. I thought that was really a big deal. I think our continued leadership in trying to increase the academic standards and the academic levels and the emphasis on academics within the Pac-10 conference, which was not one single event but kind of a constant pressure, a constant emphasis. Was significant. In terms of negatives, I think the most substantial negative thing that I recall in all my time was really something that happened at the NCAA level when the NCAA did a restructuring. This was in the early 90s. And the process for legislation, doing legislation, was kind of a complex one, but it all boiled down to proposed legislation being voted on by the entire membership of the NCAA at an NCAA conference. So that I, as a representative of Stanford, could hold my paddle up and vote yes or no on the legislation, and all the schools were represented and doing the same thing, and the conferences. And so it was a kind of a semi-chaotic, bulky sort of process, but it sort of like one school, one vote, and you kind of had the feeling there was a more democratic process. And at the time, unless the president was there, I voted. I, as the faculty member, voted. And that technically was the rule for every school. And Ted was sitting on one side and Cheryl was sitting on the other side, and an issue would come up and they would tell me what they thought we ought to do, but I would decide how I would decide how to vote. And so there was this sense that the faculty had influence and power in this process of developing legislation that really dictated how the NCAA operated. Comes the reorganization, because that was too complex and and too difficult a process to manage. So comes a reorganization to kind of streamline and make it more efficient, et cetera. And in this reorganization, the most negative thing that happened, in my opinion, was that the power and influence structure shifted. It shifted from being the athletic directors and the faculty athletics representatives holding a substantial amount of influence, and the university presidents, but they kind of come in and out. They're not there all the time. It shifted from that to having the conference commissioners now being at a much higher status, and the faculty athletics representatives dwindling in their influence and their role that they played. So the new structure had committees, had the management committee that sort of made all the big decisions, and have these other committees. And when you looked at the composition of those committees, they were very heavily loaded with commissioners and with athletic directors, and virtually none or no faculty athletics representatives. So the voice of the academic side of the enterprise was almost stamped out completely, because the concern of athletic directors is typically not the academic side. The concern of the commissioners is only one thing: money, make more money. And when the presidents would vote, because the final council that decided everything was a group of presidents, when the presidents would vote, they would walk into the meeting with the commissioner right at their ear, whispering to them about what they ought to do. So if you look at the role of television, the role of money in this whole process, it started to kind of go like that. In my view, I haven't empirically studied this, but my impression is that influence and the role of money just started going way up, starting in the early 90s when this restructuring took place. And I attribute it to the fact that the commissioners now held a lot more influence in what was going on, and their motivation was not the motivation of a faculty athletics representative who's saying, wait a minute, we got to remember that we have students here, and they're students, not just athletes. They're student athletes, and their academic side's important. Nobody was saying that. The commissioners sure as heck weren't saying it. And so as a result, when decisions got made, TV contracts got signed, playing a football game on Tuesday night or Thursday night, playing basketball games every night of the week, serves the purpose of generating a lot of money for the conferences and the schools, but who pays the cost? The students pay the cost, because they're the ones that are out of class. They're the ones that are having their weeks of going to class disrupted because they've got a game to play.
It leads into my last question, direct lead in. Should we be paying these players, and should the student athletes be unionized so that we can, is the future going to be in that direction, you think, Jerry? We're going to be paying these students, or we're going to allow the students to unionize and represent themselves, and on a collective bargaining agreement, said, I'll play for you if you pay me X.
Yeah. Are the students employees?
Yeah.
Or are they not?
Yeah.
My view is that at least for Stanford, if the new president is committed the way that John Hennessy was committed, if that happens where we have to pay students, Stanford will leave that level of athletics. We just will bail out. We won't be a part of that. And my hope would be that a lot of other schools would do the same, although I'm not sure that a lot would. I think that there's a process that's going on, and that is that the economic model that's in existence today is not sustainable over a long period of time. Because if you look at the numbers, the cost of athletics is going like that. And revenues are certainly going up, but athletics, the cost is going up at a dramatic rate. Something like 90% of all of the Division I schools are providing about $10 million a year on average to support their athletic programs. Okay, so and that money is coming out of the school coffers or students' pockets. And that means that's money that's not spent on education. On the traditional academic side of it, is spent on the athletic programs. And that's not a sustainable model. I just can't keep going forever because universities can't afford it anymore. And this could potentially bankrupt a university. So I think that the model is going to be different. I'm not sure that that the assumptions that exist today will be sustained over a long period of time. I think we were in an intercollegiate athletics academic bubble, just like the housing bubble.
Yeah.
We're in a bubble with athletics. And just like with the housing bubble, there were a whole lot of assumptions that were made about how the world was going to continue to work forever. And when we found that those assumptions were breaking down, then the whole bubble burst. And you can capture a set of assumptions about intercollegiate athletics and ask yourselves, will those sustain forever? Will people want to watch athletics on television at the rate that they're watching it? Will advertisers, as a consequence, want to pay the advertising dollars that they're willing to pay today? Will people still pay ever-increasing costs of tickets to go to athletic events? Will students continue to want to sponsor with their fees athletic programs? Will faculties continue to support athletics in their universities? I mean, there's a whole set of assumptions. Right. You can add even more to those, that if they start breaking down, the whole bubble is going to burst. And the minute television stops willing to pay all that it's been paying, all of this is going to fall apart.
Yeah. I agree.
I mean, when you've got a university that's paying 50, 60 million just to service their debt on their athletic facilities, that's not a very sustainable model to operate under. Now, not all universities are into that model, but they're driving in that direction. Yeah. So it's just not going to work. So what can happen? There are a lot of potential scenarios. One is people like Stanford we all get out of the business, and because we don't believe in the business the way it is, or because we can't afford it. So if enough places start going bankrupt, more schools will get out of it. That's one model. Another model is you spin off athletics and make it a semi-professional entity, and students they're not students necessarily. They may or may not use your university name, depending on the relationship of the dollars there. Yeah. I mean, that's a more extreme model, but it's one that is potential, because you've got these entities that are already built there, and they could just be kind of, the university outsources athletics and let them be independent and maybe use the university name. I don't like that model, but that's an economic way that it might work. And there are other kind of solutions in between, but it's not going to keep going the way it has. And what's going to break it, in my opinion, is paying the students. That's going to break it. Yeah. If you start paying the students, it's an extremely slippery slope. Are you going to pay the star quarterback? You can pay McCaffrey the same amount of money as you pay someone who's never gets into a game. Yeah. And then how much more are you going to pay him than the tight end or the right guard? It's chaos. It'll be chaotic. The professionals have a difficult time managing that. Can you imagine what universities would do? So if it gets to the point where the students are considered to be employees and need to be paid, then I think it's gone off the board. Yeah. Now, there's a notion of fairness here, and the issue is that the students, through their performance, essentially are generating the dollars, but the dollars are going to the coaches, and they're going to primarily the universities to build facilities. Those are the two big, right, the two big places that the money is going, and then they're also going to the NCAA to maintain what it's doing. But at the school level, it's the coaches, and the coaches claim that they're bringing in. Coach says, well, I bring in 100,000 people to 6 games a year, therefore I deserve a $5 million salary. Well, I mean, that's really a narrow view of the impact that coach is having. They're not bringing in the 100,000 people. I mean, how about the whole university
Right.
and the reputation of the university and all that? And the inequity between football coaches getting and basketball coaches getting paid what they're getting and university presidents getting paid 1/10 of that. So that's an inequitable balance, because we're still a university. We're not an athletic company that happens to have an educational component to it. So it's the tail wagging the dog, and we've reached that, and it's just gotten worse and worse. It'll continue to get worse until it explodes, is my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's very well said, Jerry. And I really do appreciate you taking the time to talk with us. It's been fascinating to hear your views on this subject. And I think the greatest compliment to you was of the great job you did as a faculty representative when Ramon Saldivar became your successor and said, I didn't really know about this job because I hadn't ever heard one way or about it, and that's a good thing. Because he said you've done an unbelievably good job. It was complimentary to you.
I appreciate that.
Of what you've done for the university. So thank you, and we'll look forward to talking to you again soon. That's
Great.
for sure.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry.
Yep.